Okay, there we go. All right. Hi, my name is Kathy McMillan, and I am with Dyslexia BC. And tonight we're going to be hosting a session about accomplished and delayed readers with Dr. Stephen Truch from the Reading Foundation. Um, we are really excited to have Steve talk about this. We have been having parent sessions for about 10 years now. And Steve, I would say, is one of the leading experts in reading in here in Canada, in terms of evidence, science-informed, evidence-based instruction. I think Steve is pretty much the go-to in Canada and for most of North America. So he's going to be talking tonight about accomplished and delayed readers. So Steve, if you want to go ahead, I'm going to give him the co-host so that he's able to share his screen. And if you could, if you wouldn't mind saving questions till the end, if you want to write them in the chat, I can answer. Amanda, I'm going to make you a co-host. Amanda's with the Reading Foundation as well, and we will try to answer whatever questions we can in the chat, but we'll wait to the end to ask the big questions to Steve, if that's okay with everybody. So here we go.
Can I share now?
Yeah, you can share now.
Here we go. Share. All right, I think we're into sharing and I think we're into slideshow. So welcome everybody. My name is Steve Truch, as Kathy just mentioned, and it's my pleasure to speak to you this evening. I'm the director and founder of the Reading Foundation clinics across Canada and more recently in Los Angeles. So tonight, if I can get this thing to work, which I can't, I'm not even kidding. There we go. So the main topics today are going to be, what is an accomplished reader? What is a delayed reader? Where does dyslexia fit into this perspective? And I just want to say this is just a conceptual perspective of mine. So it's not fleshed out with a bunch of numbers or anything. This is the way I see reading kind of evolving for everybody. I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about early assessment and then prevention of reading delays, and also a little bit of time on remediation of learning disabilities, including dyslexia. I will talk to you a little bit about my background first, though I think it's important to understand it. I've been an educator for over 50 years. I started as a classroom junior high school language arts teacher. Then I sort of got a thirst for knowledge and went to grad school, became a school psychologist, and I performed those kinds of duties for 10, 12, 14 years, something like that. And 2 of those years were spent as an assistant superintendent for special ed. So I got a good exposure from, everything from kindergarten to grade 12 through the school system, as well as on the administrative level. And then in 1990, I started the first Reading Foundation clinic. That was in Calgary, and we've been going strong ever since. So I think I'm allowed to talk about what we do a little bit here without trying to be, oversell or anything. We are specialized and we are intensive one-to-one remedial clinics in those 4 cities. I was trained in the Linwood Bell clinics originally and used what's now called the LIPS program for a number of years, and then switched to phonographics because of some research, and then finally wrote my own program called Discover Reading. So we do offer, when I say I wrote it originally, and then we've been rewriting it ever since, and I have some wonderful staff with lots of experience with tremendous input into these programs that I'll mention in a moment here. We do offer our services both in person and virtually, and we decide, if that's possible with a child. And anybody who's done virtual sessions know that it doesn't always work for kids. They can turn the camera off or hide or, do all kinds of things to distract themselves. The programs that we offer are in the core literacy and areas, and these are the programs we now have. So there's Discover Reading for spelling and decoding when that's the primary issue. Discover Meaning for comprehension when that's the issue. I guess Discover Writing for written expression. Discover Math for math concepts and operations, basically from grades K to 9. We're not trying to be consistent with curriculum standards. We're just covering the basics here. and a new program that we've added now called Discover Language, and we're dealing more in depth with oral language. So we've always dealt with vocabulary, but now we've got other activities in this program for syntax and morphology, and we're finding that it's actually quite an exciting addition to what we do. Okay, and how we do what we do? Well, I have to say, when I was a school psychologist, my job was to diagnose students with learning disabilities to give them access to whatever services that the school systems had. In most cases, that was just a placement in a resource room and then an accompanying individual education plan, or IEPs as they're called. And then that was it. So I had no say really in how reading was taught. That was just basically up to each individual. Each individual resource teacher had their own thing. Everybody had different philosophies. I got into lots of different kinds of discussions about what the best way was to teach reading. But what I was always looking for was any kind of research that would lead me in the right direction. And it just didn't exist at that time. And now we have this whole body that we're calling the science of reading, which is good. But I needed to develop my own battery because I didn't want everybody who came to the clinic to have to undergo a full psychoeducational assessment. They are excellent in a lot of ways, especially when kids do need IEPs, and they still do, especially when they need accommodations, and they still do. So it's very good. It's broad-based. But I had discovered in my journey from school psychology into looking for research, I discovered a piece of research that really changed my life and led to what I do now. So that research was called Categorizing Sounds and Learning to Read, and it was subtitled A Causal Connection. So of course the word causal really caught my eye because there wasn't anything causal at that point in time. It was all correlational. So I started following up on that piece of research, and I discovered then that the term sort of morphed into what we now call phonemic processing. And that's where the causal connection lies. Although we still don't have all of the elements of that causality, we know that that is a very, very important change that occurred. So once you know what you're looking for, you don't need to do a lot of these broad-based assessments, although we do cover all the literacy areas, but you can go and dig deep into what I started to call this pre-phonics area, this phonemic processing, which I knew was causally connected to reading. So once I knew that it was there, I devised ways and found ways to measure it. And so I developed a battery that takes about 2 hours of 1.5 to 2 hours of testing time with a student. And it gives us some pretty accurate and pretty precise information as to all the cognitive correlates that accompany reading issues, as well as a good baseline of scores for kids in reading, spelling, comprehension, and like that. So that's what happens when somebody comes to the clinic. We do a pre-test first, and then we provide a written report with results and with a parent consultation, and then our recommendations. And then if the student enrolls in a program, then they begin this one-to-one intensive remediation. And it also could be enrichment for kids who are not that delayed. So that's, it might be related to one of our programs or a combination of the programs. So again, we have some good clinical evidence and lots of experience to guide us into how many hours to recommend for each program. Now, when we say intensive, we do mean intensive. So the Lindemoons introduced me to this intensive remediation immersion. So students at their clinics would come 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. Wow. For the X number of weeks, depending on what they needed. So when I was first introduced to that particular model, I gasped because, of course, that was so unique. When I introduced the model after a while, because I saw it really worked well, to the Calgary scene, it was like pushback I got was pretty enormous, because the main comment was, well, how do you keep these students engaged for 4 hours when most of them can't spend 15 seconds on a task? So turned out to be one of the least of our problems. So anyway, we stick with that model, but we do adjust the hours, and we have different options for kids who can't do the intensive, and so on. So when the students enroll, they are also assigned to a team, and a team leader monitors their progress. They make adjustments as needed, and they give regular feedback to parents. The student is post-tested once they're near the end of their time with us. The results and then another report are discussed with the parents. and are any professionals who might be involved at that time, and then we make recommendations for follow-up as needed. So now let's get into what I think is just sort of an interesting view. I call it my clinical view of the reading process. This 2x2 matrix is originally appeared in the simple view of reading, which is anything but simple, by the way, but that's what it was called, still called, and it still has great sway in this, what the so-called science of reading. So what this 2x2 matrix does is allow you to compare two variables. So one variable is the reading and spelling variable, and you see it is a continuum really, although it's just divided into these quadrants, but I see it as a continuum. So we start from students who cannot decode or read or spell, and progressively they move their way up to the point where here they become quite fluent with the whole process. Then on the comprehension side, again, we have the same kind of phenomenon where students who are very weak with comprehension gradually can become stronger and stronger, and then some of them wind up where this area is particularly strong. So now you have these four particular quadrants that you can divide basically all students into just as a way to understand their needs. So in this first quadrant is what I'm going to put is the accomplished readers. So this quadrant are those students who already know how to read and spell very well and who also know how to comprehend very well. But with the comprehension, I've added a little flair here to it based on something called dual coding theory, which is a cognitive theory which with tremendous science behind it. So this is a very gross depiction of the brain in its two hemispheres. So just for the sake of simplicity and discussion, we'll say the left hemisphere is primarily involved with language processing. Those particular functions can be strong or average or weak, and we can measure some of that. And on the right-hand side here, we have those functions related to nonverbal processing, including with this little bubble diagram here, Cloud, is the ability to visualize these language concepts or some non-language concepts. And again, this kind of processing can be strong, average, or weak, and we can measure some aspects of it with our testing battery. So accomplished readers then would be yes on both quadrants. The second quadrant, though, would be those students, and if you're an educator, you see them all the time. The students who read quite well, they don't seem to have any issues with reading the words, but when you ask them what the words mean, what the concepts mean, what the language mean, they're at a loss. I mean, they can answer some questions, but they're basically at a loss, and it's almost like the words are going in one ear and out the other when they read. So they definitely need no work here most of the time, but they do need some work here, either here mostly, or some combination going back and forth. And again, that's something that we try to determine. And then we have this particular quadrant, which would be the most frequent kind of students that we see here. This is the students. Oh, I'm sorry, I just got interrupted. my apologies. I'm going to just no, I'm not going to do that either. Okay, so these are the students who are very weak with the reading and spelling element of reading, but the comprehension seems fine. So for example, if you read stories to them or text to them and ask them questions, they are able to answer the questions. So the comprehension seems fine. They might have extremely high IQs as well. I mean, they might be brilliant. So the comprehension is excellent, but for whatever reason, and we'll talk about some of those reasons in a minute, this is what is impaired. This is what needs remedial work. And we have some excellent stats on as to how much time they need when they're in this particular quadrant. And then this quadrant are those readers who need work in both processes, both the reading and spelling and then the comprehension. So again, we have to carefully assess the students and decide what that particular student needs based on their own profile. Now let's get into what I think are some characteristics of accomplished readers. Like I said, this is conceptual, and I haven't had time to really flesh it all out in detail. So I'll just give you a few things. First of all, they're in quadrant one, they can spell and read words fluently. They can self-correct most of their errors. They can monitor their rate of reading depending on their purpose. So if they need to study and go in depth, they can slow down, read, reread. If they need to skim or they're just searching for certain things, they can do that as well. So it just depends on their purpose. They set their own purpose for reading and go accordingly because all of their processes are developed to a fluent level. they understand what they read by two things, really. And that is actively processing the overall written language of what they're reading, of the text, and connecting that back to their own oral language and any background knowledge that they have or need. So this is really important. They are actively processing written language because they have the skills to do so. And then they're also, this is often overlooked in any kind of measurements that are done in the psychological field, they are also able to create mental images for language and concepts and information that they read or that they hear. And finally, they enjoy reading. I mean, if you don't enjoy reading, there's something wrong with the process. Maybe you're not quite accomplished or you've been led off track a little bit with something, but you have to enjoy reading. And then I think I see accomplished reading as a long-term goal for all readers. You are on the royal road to reading when you start as a non-reader and you just continuously develop towards accomplishment really for the rest of your life. Okay, now the adequate and typically developing an average cohort of readers, well, they can display some, even many of the characteristics of accomplished readers, but typically they're weak with the spelling. So when you see that kind of phenomenon in your testing, you're usually looking at somebody who's been compensating in some way, typically by guessing from text, or context, put it that way. And often these readers are not noticed in the classroom because when you test them, many times they will score at grade level. And they became adequate because they had to figure out by themselves right from grade 1 how to read. Okay, so if they became adequate, and let's say by the time they hit grade 3, they're scoring in the average range on a reading test, that doesn't mean they're good readers. It just means they scored average on a reading test. And you don't know quite how they got there, but there are some studies, I won't get into them today, that actually trace how that happens. Now, in order to sort of reach their potential, my thinking was, and my experience is that they do require some direct instruction. So direct instruction is an important principle of structured literacy. And it means direct teaching of some concept. It doesn't mean that you're letting the child figure out everything on their own. Now, we have this, back and forth between what's now called statistical learning and direct instruction. So statistical learning says, well, the human brain can make its own connections. And yes, that's true. But there is a cohort of readers that we have found, delayed readers, that, that's only true to a small extent. Most of the time, they need direct instruction and a lot of it to keep making progress. So the fact that they score in the average range means that their needs can often be downplayed or even totally ignored. But let me show you what happened for a few of our readers here when the parents didn't ignore this particular need. So here's some data from Calgary, Toronto, and Vancouver on what's called the Wide Range Achievement Test. This is the 5th edition. It's a reading test. It's a reading test in which students have to read a list of words that get progressively more and more difficult because, of course, they have to go from kindergarten level to all the way through adult level for these tests. So the student is able to read the words. We see how far they can read the words before they peter out and make 5 errors in a row. And then you take their raw score and convert it to what's called a standard score. And I'll put a depiction of the normal curve up in a few minutes here. But I think most of you, especially if you have an education background, you understand the normal curve. Now, this cohort of 18 students were gathered from parents who brought their kids to the clinic because they said, we're told that, everything's fine with my daughter or my son, but we just think something's wrong. She seems to be extremely bright girl, but guess what? Everything seems kind of average and we think she's capable of more than that. So we'll go ahead. So on our battery of testing, we don't do, as I said, an IQ test, but what we do is the comprehensive, receptive, and expressive vocabulary test. So it's the expressive test that we use. So the child has to identify, or we give them a word and then they have to tell us what it means. So this is kind of a proxy for overall language and a good proxy actually for intelligence, for overall IQ. So this standard score of 117, that's a very strong score. I can give you an exact percentile score here in a minute. 117 would be the 87th percentile. So these are, pretty bright children. Now, When you look at the standard score, though, for the reading test here, what you see is let's round it up to 105. So, you've got somebody who's around the 60th percentile, something like that, 66th percentile. They go through our program for a total of 59 hours. Now, if they came intensively, and most of these kids did, that's 3 weeks. 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, 20 hours a week. That's 3 weeks. So in 3 weeks, we move the bar by 18 standard score points, close to 18 points. So then now we see their post-test score actually exceeds what you would expect. Here, they're in the average range, but well below what you would expect based on their oral vocabulary. So here they exceed it. So their average gain here is 17, almost 18 points, like I said, and they gain a lot every single hour that they come. So it's an amazing kind of thing. I'll show you another cohort later, which is not quite as good as this one, but still good. Now, the delayed readers, including those with dyslexia, this group, I think, lacks many or even most of the descriptors of accomplished or even adequate or typically developing readers. They can be labeled with various diagnoses as well, like dyslexia, specific learning disability. They often have what's called comorbid diagnoses, like they have an accompanying language disorder or attention deficit disorder, or they may be on the spectrum, or anxiety disorder, and so on. So all of these things happen. Our clinical experience and data supports the idea that with the right stuff, I'll define what I mean by that in a minute, delayed readers can move towards the average range or even better. Now, this is a very important point because it means that kids don't have to be stuck where they are. What is the right stuff, though? The active ingredients for students, for strong remediation. That's what it means, the right stuff. And I'll answer some of those ingredients and talk about them after the next 3 slides. So first of all, we could spend a lot of time just talking about what dyslexia means. So I'm just going to cut to the chase with Dr. Jack Fletcher's definition, which I think really does cut to the chase. It says it's a word level reading disorder. So children who are dyslexic typically have tremendous difficulty reading a word. They can sound it out, or they know what it is because they guess it, or they see it one time, and the next time it's gone. It's gone from their memory. It's like it didn't even happen. So it's a word level reading disorder. Now, I want to say a little bit too, though, about what disorders mean. Disorders and diagnoses of any kind are subject to change. You don't have to be stuck in that rut. They change because just of the natural development of the individual. We do see people who are, say, could be labeled with a learning disability when they're in grade 2, and then maybe just because they, quote, grow out of it. They don't just grow out of it. Something happened to make that happen. But, they no longer qualify for that kind of diagnosis. So that just can happen naturally. It's happened on occasion in my experience. I remember one occasion in particular where I assessed a student in grade 2, I think, whose IQ was like way up there, 130, something like that. And then in grade 7, like it was like average. Like, whoa, what happened to that child? Okay. The other reason that things can change is because we as humans can design interventions for the individual. That can be an intervention for, say, a physical or a psychological problem, or for something to do with literacy. So interventions, especially those that involve direct teaching, there's that word again, they do change, in my experience, they change everything for that person. So the next slide, I'll just go into a little bit about the bell curve and discuss how that works. And then the following slide is going to show you how the gains are analyzed for different intervention programs and the approaches that have the right stuff. So here's the old curve. So I just want to say that we don't have to go into major stats here, but basically the curve is a graphic representation of what happens when you go out there and test people on 1,000 things. It could be weight, it could be height, it could be reading scores, math scores, anything like that. You test enough people, most of the time, there's different kinds of curves, but most of the time you're going to get these normal curves. And what that means is that you're going to get a small cohort, low frequency here, of students who score extremely low. So this x-axis is the scores. low to high. So very low frequency here, and on the y-axis, the frequency. So low here and low here and high. So here, this student is in the bottom 2% of students their own age, and this one is above 98% of them. So there's a huge difference here. And then when test makers make tests, typically they will create what are called standard scores. So for tests like this, a typical midpoint is a standard score of 100, which puts that person above 50% of students in his or her own age group. And then the average range typically chosen is between 90 and 110, because that includes about half of the population. And then everything else can be divided up or down on the curve accordingly. Then you wind up with these standard scores with these kinds of bifurcations, and then percentiles that represent that. So for example, if you have a standard score of 90, that's the 25th percentile. If you have one 109, that's the 74th percentile, 110, 75th percentile, and so on. I'm going to just ignore these minor scale scores here. That's a different kind of scale score, but they still are representative and can be drawn on a normal curve like this one. Okay, now this is from a book called Essentials of Assessing and Overcoming Reading Difficulties, a wonderful tome published in 2015 by Dr. David Kilpatrick. And he presents incredible amounts of information on word reading, which I suggest is an excellent book. If you haven't already read it, you should. And in chapter 11, I think it is, he took a great deal of time and effort to read research. He read research study after research study on all these different programs. So published research. And what he did is he categorized the programs based on the standard score gains for the student. So if I go back here to the average range, the standard score gains are really important. So for example, let's say you have a student who starts out with a standard score of 80, and you put them into a program that is in that first silo, and they make 3 standard score point gains after X number of hours. Okay, well, they've gained, but not a whole lot. In fact, you might even say that that gain is not much better than measurement error, but they gain something. Now, if you put them at 80 and they wind up at, say, 88, that's more impressive. Now they've made a bigger gain. If you start at 80 and you get a 15-point gain, now you're 95. Okay, now you're getting right into that mid-range. So that's an incredibly strong gain for those students. So that's what he thought was a better metric to measure gains. There's another metric that researchers often use called effect size, but in terms of showing where a student stands relative to somebody else in his or her age group in the normal population, standard scores are the way to go. They're the best metric. So here we have all these different kinds of programs that he reviewed, and here's the kind of standard score gains he got in the published research. So we'll see things that are quite familiar here, like we dabbled with fast forward for a while. That thought that was a big breakthrough. It wasn't. Reading recovery was used by the whole language people as their answer to delayed readers. Again, their results are very weak. Repeated reading is just the way it sounds. You just keep repeating things and memorizing text. You don't get gains. Now here, Orton-Gillingham is probably the most ubiquitous program out there. Like everybody has some kind of Orton-Gillingham training. So I'm not going to try to start a new reading war here by saying, well, this is what the research tells us. There's probably lots of great OG tutors out there who get better scores. The difficulty is that it's very difficult to get these kinds of standard score point gains on them, because a lot of them don't even do pre and post testing. I'm sure many do, so don't throw the tomatoes at me just yet. So there's always exceptions, but this is what you're finding in general from a very good review of research. Then you have other programs that come up with, say, 6 to 9 point gains. And in there, I put Dr. Maureen Lovis. These, usually when you see a research name like this is a research-based program. Either they developed them themselves or they created something and used it in a research study. from something, borrowed something from somebody else. So Maureen Lovett, Dr. Maureen Lovett, has got a beautiful program that's called Empower. There's about a 35-year history of studies on this particular program and the components of the program, so it's excellent. And they do indeed get very good gains, so, nothing to sneeze at with this. And then Dr. Kilpatrick put Orton Wilson reading system in this Orton Gillingham pile. He said it's just an offshoot of it. Indeed, most of the research is the outcomes come out here. But I did find one study with Wilson where the outcome was, I think, 5.8 points. So in brackets, because this is adapted from Kilpatrick, it's not in his book. I put it in the moderate group. And then the programs with the substantial gains are those that get 12 to 25 points. And here you see our program, Discover Reading. You see phonographics, and you see the LIPS program. So these programs, we have clinical experience with all three of them. And actually this data comes from a comparison of those three programs in our clinics over time. These researchers, Alexander, Torgerson, and others, are using basically the LIPS program in these studies. And then I did also add in brackets, because it's not in Kilpatrick's book, the Read, Write, and Type program, which was created by absolute brilliant neuropsychologists in the United States, Dr. Janine O'Hara. So her program was compared to the LIPS program for students in kindergarten, and they followed them up for 2 years. So from kindergarten to I think, end of grade 2, what they found was the standard sort gains were in this category, and there were no real differences between Read, Write, and Type and the LIPS program. So basically it's saying, look, there's more than one way to get really substantial gains. And I think that's been my lesson for a long time now. Okay, now phonology is an important building block for literacy, very important. Definitions and descriptions of delayed reading, such as dyslexia, emphasize the origins in a phonological core deficit. So this deficit is not related to intelligence, but it can affect the child's oral language and often the early stages of spelling and reading, including alphabet recognition. So you can see this kind of continuing developing from a very young age. Now, heredity obviously plays a big part in the beginning stages, and we know that there are even some genetic markers for dyslexia and so on. But again, let's not get too caught up on that, because everything can change with direct instruction. So heredity, language delays, the home environment, how much stimulation the child gets, how much reading they get, and like that, they all play a part and influence the ease with which children can be taught to explicitly unravel speech. And gender does not seem to be a factor. So this explicitly unraveling speech, what is that then? So let's go back to this phonological weakness. So phonology is really the umbrella term. It's for how sounds of language are created to form words and so on. But it's the umbrella term and a little more descriptive and a little sublexical term is what I call it. So a word is a lexicon, so you say a word, any word, that's the whole word. But the parts of that word are the phonemes. And for reading, the importance of phonemic processing, which I first came across in that study I mentioned in the 80s, for decades now, this phonemic processing has been studied ad nauseum, and it's well established that this is an important contributor to the reading and spelling of children. Now, we can measure phonemic processing with various tasks or skills. So there's three of them that we'll deal with today, just now. So one of them is segmenting, the other is blending into individual phonemes, and then the third one will come in a little bit later. So I'm going to just say a word, and what I want you to do is mentally just figure out what the sounds are in this word. Some of you will be able to do it like that, and some of you may be struggling. So we'll just see for yourself what it's like for you. So tell me what the sounds are in the word must. So in your mind, you should be doing some kind of what's called phonemic segmenting. Now, what that means is that you are able to explicitly identify each of the phonemes that is spelled by a particular letter. So the phonemes are s, and t, 4 phonemes. Now, if you started to do it by figuring out how to spell the word with, and what sound the word spells, that's not phonemic anymore, that's phonics. You can still get the correct answer, but you're not doing it phonemically. Okay, the next one is blending. So I'm going to give you some sounds and see in your mind if you can blend a word and recognize its meaning. So the sounds are O, A, G. Now in your mind, the word flag should have popped up. And if it did, that's excellent, because that would be the correct answer. So again, phonemically, you should have been able to do it by simply blending the sounds together. Now, we already did this one. So the ability to mentally manipulate phonemes within words, such as being able to replace one phoneme with another in any position within a word, is another and very important skill. So here's an example. Say to yourself, say the word bar. Now say it again, but say t instead of b. So instantly, you should have come up with the word tar. Okay, so this business of instant as opposed to accurate is very important. According to Dr. Kilpatrick, who sort of stretched this a little bit further now. Again, we won't go too far into that today. But I do want to point out that the programs that include those phonemic manipulation activities are found in those programs that brought about those substantial outcomes, that the 12 to 25 point standard score gains. And then Kilpatrick says manipulation accuracy is not sufficient. It needs to become proficient, it needs to become automatic. So again, we'll leave that alone for now. So the other thing I want to point out is there's so many programs now that teach phonemic processing. And so everybody thinks that that's all you need. It isn't, in my experience. By itself, phonemic processing is just not a reading program. But the lack of it leads to reading and spelling issues. So you can say that it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for learning how to read. And this is particularly true for the English language, so I'll bring that point out in a minute here. But let's go back to that core deficit assumption. The assumption from some researchers is that this phonological core deficit, which you could say is heritable, affects the brain's wiring. In other words, your brain is wired differently from birth. And ultimately, then that's going to affect your ability to learn to spell and read. Okay, I mean, that makes a great deal of sense, actually. In fact, for a long time, I believed it very thoroughly, that your genetics basically determined everything, because back when I was in grad school, we didn't have MRIs. We just had, I won't even describe what we had, but basically the hemispheres of adult dyslexics were very different than those of normal people, we'll put it that way. And so it was very discouraging. It was like, well, yeah, how do you change that? Well, it's a matter of cause and effect. So we'll leave that for another time, I guess. But we would expect, though, just based on this core deficit, that you should see variations in the degrees of single word reading and spelling delays based on that deficit and its impact on subsequent reading and spelling. So we would also expect now, though, because of what I'm saying about how things can change with direct instruction, that the right stuff can move the dial. Now, what we mean by moving the dial is we're taking somebody who's over here on the left-hand side of that bell curve and moving them up. That's what you want to see from a program, right? And you want to see something that can do that in a fairly short period of time and make a substantial difference to that particular child. So the right stuff, then, in my opinion right now, has to have direct instruction. It has to have phonemic segmenting and blending and manipulation built into it, and many of the other building blocks, like sound letter knowledge, that you need to read, spell, and comprehend words. That's just what any good program will do. So data from my clinics for the second and third expectations are presented in the next 3 slides, except I'm not going to spend too much time on other than the first one, dealing with word reading, spelling, and comprehension. So here we go. What I did a few years back is I was thinking about the normal curve, and I was saying, well, if this core deficit manifests itself, we should be able to see some degrees of delay then as far as reading scores go with all the students that we see. So I started thinking of them as in different subtypes, just different categories. So here we have the first category was average. Now, down below here, I'm going to just show you the tests that we normally, well, we do put them in our battery of testing when we do the pre-testing. So we do a decoding measure using the Kaufman test of educational achievement, the third edition. And what this test does is measure the child's ability to read non-words. And you say, well, why non-words? Well, because if they can read a non-word, they haven't been guessing at it. They know that particular word, or they at least have enough skill to sound it out. They may not do it proficiently, which is another thing, because this is an untimed test. Then we have the wide range achievement test, which I've introduced before, the fifth edition for reading, single word reading, and then the Kaufman test of educational assessment, the second edition for comprehension score. So this was a 4-year period where we collected the data on these students and then divided them into these different categories of delay. So first we have the students who score average. Now the students in what I use here for average is they have to have a score equal to or greater than 95 on all of these standardized measures. So let's see what happened with them. We had 45 students here in that group. Remember the last one we just had 18. They spent a few more hours, 67 hours there. The pre-test score was 106, post-test score was 118, and their CREF score, their average vocabulary score, was 112. So again, very strong gains here for these students. 12 standard score points. Now you see that their CREF score, 112, and their post-test reading score is above their potential. This is always good news. Okay, now the students in the mild group here, they had standard scores of 89 to 94 on at least one standardized measure. We had 57 in that group. The average hours they put in was about 4 weeks, 4.5 weeks of the intensive. Pre-test score is 93. So that's a good score. I mean, nothing wrong with 93. It's at the low end of the average range though. But by the time they finish those 4 weeks, they're at 110. Now, there you go. That's a huge gain. So you go from, you go right up to the 90, the 75th percentile actually from this starting point here. And their CREF score now basically is equivalent to what you see here, where otherwise it was well below. So they were not achieving to their potential beforehand. The next group is the moderate group. Standard scores of 80 to 88 on at least 2 measures. And here's their gains as well. So you see again, the total gain here is well into that category of the most effective programs. One thing that's always disturbing to me though is, okay, you got your post-test score here. You made huge gains from 83 to 103, but your CREF score was 109. So that means you should be able to be at 109. You should be in this category here. Well, why aren't you? Well, because, really it's a matter of hours. And because this is an expensive one-to-one program, students don't complete the total number of hours that are recommended because, their circumstances change. They have to bring the student to the clinic all the time. They run out of funds, to be blunt. I mean, but if you multiply the average gain per hour by the number of hours that they've missed compared to the ones we recommend, you'll find that score will probably pop right into where it should go. The severe though, and the severe and the ultra severe next, they're more challenging. So the severe, they start with 75 to 79 on at least 2 tests. So now we're talking about students here who are 76 to start with. That's the 6th percentile. They wind up at 98. That's the 45th percentile. So the average gain here, look at that, incredibly strong. But again, 107 and 97 don't match. So more hours, they would get higher scores. And then the ultra severes, the ones that are, the most difficult really, because these kids all started at the 1st percentile. They move up to 83, which is the 13th percentile, but they're still well below where they could be just based on an average score. And again, it's just a question of multiplying more hours because we have the average gain per hour. We know how many more hours it would take to get that student to that level. So that's where it goes. Now, the total here at 300 students in this time period here, their overall average gain was 17 points, and you can see it was different for each cohort. The percentage of males and females, which I've kind of neglected here, is roughly always a little bit more males than females, but here the moderate group, interestingly enough, was pretty much evenly split. Okay, now I'm not going to go into the same detail with spelling, other than just to show you the average overall gain for spelling is 12 points. It's very difficult to keep the reading and spelling scores at the same level. Everybody knows it's harder to teach spelling because you can identify words more easily by using more than just decoding. So the average gain in spelling has to occur when you get the exact order of the spelling for every word correct. We have other ways to measure spelling growth too that we call developmental scale, but these are strong scores. And then the comprehension, again, you see the average gain is 11 standard score points. We go from a pretest of 83 to 94. Excellent gains here for comprehension. So it's not neglected when you deal with decoding and spelling. Now, reading and spelling growth by itself is affected by how students are initially taught the English code. So here's some big differences that come up. Alphabet systems around the world appear in many countries. And what they have in common, all these systems, is a way to spell the phonemes of the respective oral language, the words of that country. And then phonemes in every language differ. You have more phonemes in some languages than you do in others. So for example, well, we'll talk about that in a minute too, but you do have some languages like Spanish, for example, where there are something like 24 phonemes. I know if there's linguists out there, they'll argue with me on that, but I'm just going to use some rough numbers here. Greek has maybe 23 phonemes. Italian has 32 or so. And each of those phonemes is spelled by a certain script. So the script can look different. So as you know, say Cyrillic or Greek script is very different from the Roman script that we use in English. And the nature of the English alphabet itself presents challenges for all readers. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about these two types of what are called orthographies, which is just a fancy name for alphabets, opaque versus transparent. So a transparent alphabet, such as Italian, is one where the relationship between the phoneme of that language is represented by a single letter, a single script, a single alphabet letter in that language. So that's a one-to-one, what's called one-to-one correspondence between the sound and the letter. So you can see instantly that the relationship then is very reciprocal, isn't it? So if you know the sound, you pretty much know the letter once you've learned that. If you know the letter, you pretty much know the sound once you've learned that. So it should be easier in those languages, and this is true for Italian and Spanish and all of the languages that have a transparent alphabet. It's easier when you see the comparisons of children's reading and spelling reading scores in particular, by the end of grade 1, children in Italy can read and spell quite effectively. It takes the English children learning the English language, that is, 2 more years to accomplish the same feat. So they're delayed by 2 years just because it's English. Yikes. Okay, that's what an opaque system is. English and French is another good example of opaque, where the relationship between the sound, the phoneme, is not one-to-one. Some parts of English are one-to-one, yes, but many parts are not. And that's what gets confusing for kids because of the way they're taught. So beginners of English are taught to read words, and here's some less desirable approaches that we know for sure from tons of research. Memorizing whole words is we all of us, I'm sure, I know I did. You went to school in grade 1 and you got a list of words and you're supposed to go and memorize them. Well, you can memorize a few of them for sure, but that is not a good way to learn the English language or any language. Guessing. That became huge when whole language took over. Variations of guessing. The 3Q system became prominent with balanced literacy, but it was still just guessing. Partial decoding, another guessing strategy. And then another thing I think that happens a lot is spelling sort of becomes a sideline. Spelling's not important. You have spell check and you can do this and that. You don't need to even know how to spell according to a lot of educators, but you do. I mean, you have to know how to spell And if you know how to spell enough, and if spelling takes a priority, you actually should be better off. So we have some research that supports that hypothesis as well. The more desirable approaches are what I call now in the last 2-3 years in particular, the speech to print phonics approaches. There's another term for that was developed by Dr. Diane McGinnis, a brilliant cognitive scientist. Linguistic phonics, she called it. Linguistic phonics as opposed to visual phonics. So speech to print phonics, that's systematic. That means you don't omit any phonemes and you don't omit any of these letter sound combinations. If the speech to print gives spelling a high priority and includes a range of phonemic activities that in the end build for phonemic proficiency, and so then you're going to get better results once you introduce sound letter teaching, because that's the next step. So these are some of the ingredients needed in speech to print phonics. I want to explore that idea a little bit further. There's speech to print phonics versus print to speech phonics. Okay, print to speech phonics constitutes the vast majority of phonics approaches to teaching the English code. And I agree, some phonics is better than no phonics, but print to speech phonics, remember what you're doing here. You're looking at letters and words spelled in English, and you're looking for patterns because you want to teach those patterns to kids. So you wind up figuring out a few rules because there are some patterns when you look at the English words in that fashion. But their rules are usually cumbersome with a lot of exceptions and then exceptions to the exceptions. So I'll give you a good example is silent E rule. So the silent E rule is supposed to somehow make the letter say a sound. Well, that's forgetting that we speak, not the letters. Letters don't speak, we do. So we represent what we speak with letters. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important one. So you get these rules. Okay, you get a silent E rule, and then the child, and I've seen this many times in our clinics, comes to a word like come, C-O-M-E. And they sound it out because they've been taught this rule, not by us, by the way, but usually by traditional school instruction. And they come up with the word comb. Well, that works. That follows the rule, doesn't it? Except it doesn't. So then you say, well, it doesn't work in that word. So we'll call that a jail word or a word that doesn't play fair or something like that. So in our program and in any program like ours, that's speech to print, you will deal with that particular challenge in a different way. And we do that by starting with speech. So the approach of going from speech to print turns the whole phonics issue upside down, inside out, you could say. So English has 44 sounds or phonemes. So the student with direct instruction needs to be exposed to those 44 phonemes, not all at once. It's too confusing, but gradually and systematically exposed to the phonemes. Usually a good program is going to start with the ones that are quite regular, where there's more transparency, where there's more one-to-one correspondence. So kids will start reading, I don't know, pop on pop, that kind of stuff, because there's that regularity, the sound, one letter thing. But they have to be exposed into various ways in which the phonemes can be spelled. So once you have the anchor point in the phoneme itself, you can show the child gradually how the options also work. There are different ways to spell the sound different ways to spell the sound E, and so on. But always going back to how that word is pronounced in the child's own language. Okay, so that leads us now to a couple of things here. Preventing reading and spelling difficulties and delays. How does that occur? Well, prevention starts with early identification. With Kathy McMillan and Dyslexia BC have been hammering this point home for years and trying to get changes going with BC government. And to their credit, I think that some of that is starting, and it is in fact starting across the country for different reasons. So early screening is important, because you should be able to screen out the kids who need more help right from the get-go, because it's going to become pretty obvious. And there are a lot of good screening tests around. But the question then is, well, then what? Well, then it should proceed to direct teaching in kindergarten and grade 1. And that's where the choice of programs and the training of the teachers becomes incredibly important. So effective and evidence-based instructional methods do systematically teach the sound letter combinations in English, starting with those that are transparent and then helping students learn those that are more challenging. And there's a number of very excellent speech to print programs, as I found out in the last year. I'll just call them linguistic programs right now, that are available now for classroom application and training. So email me if you'd like a summary of those programs, and I'll be happy to send you my little brief summary of them. Now, this is an important quote that I'm going to put up next. Results from research from effective early remediation. So here's a quote from Dr. Dr. Lovett, Maureen Lovett. With effective early remediation, and what she means by that, explicit phonics instruction and decoding strategy training, paired with opportunities to develop fluency through practice, offered for 1 year in grade 1 and another year in grade 2, then at the end of that period of time, 2 of 3 children will no longer meet the criteria for reading disabilities. This I just read recently in the Journal of Learning Disabilities, the December issue, but it was actually a quote that she made in 2017 based on a bunch of research they did at that point. I mean, that's powerful. It says that with the right program, the right stuff. Now, remember her program, this is the Empower program. This became the Empower program. You're still getting those outcomes in the 6 to 9 point gain range, but that's still very impressive, especially if you're talking about a system-wide approach. Now, the story, though, for dyslexics, this is the next quote, it's very different. Dr. Sally Shaywitz is probably one of the world's authorities on dyslexia. So here's what she says about the key to remediating spelling and reading delays. Remediating reading delays, including dyslexia, is challenging for a number of reasons. What's important is the choice of programs and an understanding of how intense and how many hours delayed readers require. Programs with the strongest outcomes, like those in slide 15, are based on the linguistic phonics approach, which also includes phonemic manipulation activities. But how intense and how many hours depends, in my clinical experience, on how delayed they are in the first place. So I think I illustrated that with the RAT5 results to begin with. But here's what Dr. Shaywitz had to say. A child with dyslexia who's not identified early may require as much as 150 to 300 hours of intensive instruction. That's at least 60 minutes, but better yet, 90 minutes or more every day for most school days over a 1 to 3 year period, if she's going to close the reading gap between herself and her peers. The longer identification and effective reading instruction are delayed, the longer the child will require to catch up. So I think there's some nuances in there that I want to say. Number one is it's never too late. Our experience with older students is that many of them can still get very average scores after a period of intensive instruction. So it's not just a question of early identification, it's a question of how delayed they are in the first place. So that degree of delay, I think, goes back to that phonological core deficit, and I look desperately for ways that we can still move that lowest quadrant up a little quicker. I just keep looking for things that do that. Okay, and my experience is that even these numbers from Dr. Shaywitz are understated, really. Okay, so questions and answers. I think I've stopped talking. And there we go. So I can't see anybody now because I've sort of put you guys on the side. Oh, there we go.
I didn't notice any questions coming in in the chat here. But one question for me, Steve. So there's a few intense remedial centers in BC here, like in the Lower Mainland, or there's BC's starting to close down some of their separate learning centers. Um, for instance, one of my children went to one in Coquitlam here, where they were there for 4 hours a day, or three and a half anyway. And they used Linda Mood Bell in the center, and not only was it more intense, but my daughter also wasn't exposed to the regular school day, which I think really helped the remediation process, because her brain wasn't overly full of the everyday academics. Like what
Right.
would you
Yep.
say about that? Like, one of the things that we do here at Dyslexia BC is help parents sort of negotiate with the school about what's best for their child. And you can definitely do, these types of programs, whether they're private or within the public system, within the IEP and within the school sort of day. And anyways, I don't know what my question is, but what's your feeling on, separating the remediation from school? Is it a better
Yeah,
thing or a worse thing, or what, like?
okay. Well, I mean, certainly I think it depends somewhat on the age for sure. But think of it this way, if you're a student in elementary school and you are quite delayed as a reader, right? Then you're struggling every single day. You're struggling through your language arts class, you're struggling through social studies, everything else is you're struggling through, unless you found some ways to accommodate that or bypass it and still learn and like that. So to me, it's always a good trade-off. If we can think of, say, coming to the Reading Foundation or the Linda Bell Clinic or one of those effective programs for 4 hours a day, that's the language arts period as far as I'm concerned. Right? So I think it's a good trade-off. Then the students in the afternoon, this is what many parents have done. The students in the afternoon can go back to school and do, some of the social things or phys ed or like that. So I think it's important that we understand from a research point of view, there's no question in my mind, and experiential point of view, there's no question that this is the better way to go with that intensive thing. And homework be darned, for a few weeks. What does that mean? Once a child can read, then they're going to be in a far better position to be more independent learners. However, reality sets in. And, a lot of parents don't want their children to miss that much school time if the student has to come for 8 or 10 weeks, for example. So we have to modify that, and we do. We do modify that, but we don't want to do it at the expense of what? Uh, Faster learning on the part of the child. What we want for the child to experience is success in a rapid fashion. So most kids that come here and do the Discover Reading program, for within a week or two, they're saying they're just changed. They're completely changed because what they were expecting was more of the same, and what they're getting is very different. Many students will come up to us and say, Dr. Truch, why don't they teach this in schools? When they say this makes so much sense. Well, I mean, there you go. So the question that you're asking, Kathy, I think has to do with how the system approaches these issues. And there are very few intensive delivery systems that are public in school systems in Canada, I think. Most of it is privately based. I think you mentioned that one.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
in BC, I would say most of it is in the lower mainland. So like
yeah.
in
So
the
there you
big
go. Yeah,
urban area, not necessarily in the remote, more rural areas.
yeah,
So
yeah.
we have a couple more questions here.
Sure.
Let's see here. Do children with dyslexia often have difficulty writing? And if so, what kind of support can help?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, they often do have difficulty with writing. Now, if you're talking about writing, are you talking about just the actual production of letters and in a nice, concise and accurate fashion? Or are you talking about the ability to produce, written expression, create sentences, and so on? Or are you talking about both? So again, when we do the assessments with the kids, we see those kinds of mixes. One of the things that I think is really important for all students is precise alphabet production, and it's terribly neglected, uh, but is often needed with students. Many of our students need to go back really and experience how to produce the letter A, B, C, D, and so on. That can take up an enormous amount of time. So we can steer our clients into different directions for that to still occur and not be paying a whole bunch of money every hour for us to be doing something that they could be doing as homework or in other fashions, like maybe on an iPad or like that. But that's an important question. And then as far as the sort of the manuscript, fixing up that part of it, that can be relatively easy. What's harder is helping the student to construct language in his head or her head and putting it down on paper by spelling words properly. So that goes back to how we teach spelling in the first place. And when students realize that they can make connections and start spelling words, maybe if they're not quite accurate, but they can spell them, then that's an important process to start encouraging with them. So again, this happens in school systems a lot, but it's gone overboard to the point where teachers say, well, it doesn't even matter how they spell, just put down whatever you're writing, and that's that. So the children don't get any feedback necessarily. I mean, sometimes they do, I'm sure, on where they're making their mistakes when spelling words. And the more words the student can read or spell fluently, the more effective they're going to be as readers and writers. So in the end, that accomplished reading stuff is important. That's where we want to go with all these children in the long run. And there's many ways to accomplish that. So we have to keep hammering away till we find the right stuff, right? For each of these components.
We have another question here coming from a teacher, and they have used Linda Mood with
Okay.
success. And what is your opinion of the visualize, verbalize for
Yeah,
comprehension?
sure. That's a great program, I think. It's very direct, it's sequential, and it teaches the process of visualizing information, which is exactly what we do as well with Discover Meaning. So either program will get you excellent results, but that's a good program.
Okay. I've heard good things about verbalization, visualization as well.
Mhm.
One of my kids, I think, did use it in a center here in Coquitlam in the public system about
Yep.
more than 10 years ago. Another question, do you have any data on what age the kids benefit most from your program? Secondly, have you seen COVID impacting the age of kids in your program?
COVID, I'll answer the last one first. COVID has not impacted the age, no, but it has impacted students without a doubt. I think they're way more behind now than they ever were. And then, do I have data on age effectiveness? And I'd say not a. I think children will vary, of course, but I think you can do some good systematic teaching with children as young as about 5. So the kindergarten programs, for example, some systematic instruction of the code using a linguistic phonics or speech to print phonics approach is going to bring good results in a hurry. But even then, you're going to see this spread of the normal curve. It's just a phenomenon of nature, the way nature works. So you'll get excellent results probably for most kids, or you'll get some results for most kids, but you'll still see them. There'll be some that just catch on quickly, some that are kind of in the middle, and some that need more push, more introduction to direct instruction. But using a good program at that age will give you those categories fairly quickly, and then you'll know who to give attention to very quickly and how to do it. That's what's equally important. So I hope that answers your question, but if not, that's the best I can do this time of the night.
And you can follow up with Steve,
Sure, you can write to me as
and we're
well.
gonna, in an email, probably tomorrow or the next day, I'll be sending out, email addresses for Amanda, Steve, and myself, and we can answer more questions for sure. I have another question. What would be the best way for classroom teachers, grades 1 to 3, to go about teaching reading to their whole class with the limited amount of time
Mhm.
they have within their curriculum? That's
Well,
a loaded question, I
it
think.
sure is. It's it's a question of using the time you do have in the most effective fashion. So you want to use a program that's going to give you the stronger results, not the program that gives you weaker results. So I would say, like I said, if you write to me, I'll send you a list of these speech to phonics programs. And many of them offer teacher training at a pretty reasonable prices that will do that. But I could be happy to share that information with you. The other thing I have to say is that this is largely the responsibility of the Department of Education in every province, right? Isn't it? So the, educators just debate things forever before they make any kind of decisions. For example, I found this segmenting, this phonemic processing uh, research article in the 1980s. And I would have thought, I started the clinic in 1990, and I thought that, this is so important and so compelling that I'll be out of business pretty soon because the school systems are going to see how quickly, they're going to catch on to this and start introducing programs that do exactly what we're doing here in the clinic. And lo and behold, it's 35 years later. That's just starting, and there's so many arguments back and forth about which programs to use and so on. It just gives me headaches. It's, so you need a good program. You need to be trained in a good program. You might have a good program. You might be able to tweak it a little bit and get even a better program. So the more you understand about how word reading works, the more that can happen. But I would urge you to go in a direction of finding something that is speech to print to begin with, and you will get better results than almost any kind of phonics program.
Okay, I think that is about all the questions. If anybody wants to write anything else in there, please let me know right away here. Yeah, for one of my kids, we went to see Steve when my son was actually in high school, but he was probably on the mild had mild dyslexia, and he went for about 6 weeks intensive, and it completely changed. He graduated UBC on the honor roll. I don't know that he would have gone to university in the first place. He wasn't confident as a learner. He wasn't confident in himself. It just completely changed his perception of what he could do, and it changed his life. My daughter, who had severe dyslexia, um, we didn't actually have her go to the Reading Foundation, but we found other ways to get her through. She's at the University of Victoria and on the honor roll with accommodations and stuff like that. So every
Yeah,
learner is different, and every kid's going to respond to different programs. That we just didn't find Steve until we didn't find the Reading Foundation until my daughter had already been through about 8 years of different programs, and so at some point you got to do the law of diminishing returns and say, okay, this poor kid has been at a tutor every day for her entire life. So, let her enjoy her after school time, or,
yeah, sure.
enough
No, I
is
understand
enough,
that. It's,
enough is enough kind of
yeah,
thing.
right. Yeah, reality takes over, right? So
Yeah. So
true.
as a parent, you need to figure those things out as a family and see what's going to work for you.
Yeah, yeah.
Tomorrow we're having a session about the disability tax credit, and that can help you get a credit where, it's just given to you and you can use that money towards computers or towards tutoring. We also talk about using the medical tax benefit, which means you can claim up to 20% of. So with Steve's program for my son, we claimed 20% of that on our taxes and got quite a good chunk of money back. And you can do that for other programs as well. So if you feel like coming tomorrow, that should be a great session for you to learn about getting some money to help with the remediation process. So any other questions?
There was one more in the chat, Kathy.
Okay, do you want to read it, Amanda?
Sure. It says, you mentioned decoding. Where can I find more information about the decoding strategy for dyslexia?
Well, I think I've sort of covered the ground there by saying what you need to explore is information on speech to print programs. And because they're the best ways to teach decoding.
And what I guess what we wanted to make clear with this is there isn't a one size fits all kit for every kid. That's the thing.
No, but there are, no, but there are still better programs that are better suited, say, to classroom instruction than others.
Yeah.
You don't want to have 15 different programs going at the same time with a
No.
class of 15. I mean, that doesn't make sense either. So you need to have one good comprehensive program that introduces the code in a fashion that we'll call research-based. And we have great outcomes from these speech to print programs. So you have that. And then from there, you can sort out the kids who need more attention, maybe with a different type of program. Like, we have the response to intervention model, for example. So tier one of the model is the good, effective classroom instruction. Well, that doesn't even happen in most classrooms. So there's the problem to start with. And then tier two programs would be the ones that the kids need a little bit more help, maybe in a different program. And then tier three are the ones that really need that intensive support all the way through. And again, probably in a different program. But you need to start with a really good, effective classroom-based program. And there's plenty of them out there now, but they just don't seem to be making their way into the school systems very effectively, because everybody has a different idea about how that should work. So, I mean, we could spend all night debating that one, and
Yeah.
I'd rather not. So just, whoever asked that question, please write to me. I'll send you that list of, there's about 20 different speech to print programs that you can get. And a lot of that training you can get online, and you can become very familiar and very adept at these programs with that sort of training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Steve will help anybody who wants to try to find a better program. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Also the reading, is it the Reading League, Steve? They've just come out with in the last year, like lists of programs that are sort of on the good list, on the good side, rather than on the bad side. So there's actually places online that are quite easily accessed just from doing a search. I think is it the Reading League that I'm thinking of,
I'm
Steve?
not familiar with them doing it that way, Kathy.
Yeah. Oh, I'll see if I can find it and
Sure,
I'll
sure.
put it
Send
in
that to
the
me.
email
Thank you.
because I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure in the last couple months they've come up with like a comprehensive list
that could be. It could
of
be.
good program of better programs.
Yeah,
Uh,
put it that way. I think Kilpatrick's, those three tranches are the best we have so far in terms of a good research-based idea of what programs to use. And one of the things I've been trying to get him into, well, to get him to look at is the difference between the print to speech and the speech to print. And I think he acknowledges that could be an important point too.
we should see if we could get David Kilpatrick to do a session with us.
Yeah,
Do that.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's try. Sarah had a question here. Curious about using different programs at all of these tiers. Is that an issue? Sorry. So different programs at different tiers. They talk about, Steve, you've heard about tier one, tier
Yeah,
two, tier three.
yeah, yeah.
So I have heard some people say, and I don't necessarily agree with, that you can use the same program throughout the tiers, just give it more intensely. I kind
Yeah, that's a possibility. That's one way that people differentiate those three tiers. You use the same program, but instead of in tier one, it's with the whole classroom. Tier two, it's with a small group. Tier three, it's one-to-one. Now, I'm not sure that would work that well.
I have
But
reservations too, because my thinking is if you're doing the screening, you want to tailor the instruction to meet the needs of what pops up in the screening. So if you're just following,
no,
no? Okay.
no, because it depends on what you're measuring. See, the problem with screeners is they're dividing the reading process up into several variables, we'll say. Say this variable's strong, this one's weak, this one's like that. And so we tackle that, but really, I think you just need to start with a strong speech to print program to begin with, right? Because nature's going to sort out the kids who are going to be natural at whatever it is, and then the better program is going to give you better results for all of the kids. And then I think it's up to the school system or the school to sort out what the child needs next. And that might be actually more attention with just the same program in a small group. So
Okay.
we're currently working with a kindergarten school right now with four and 5-year-olds in it. And that's exactly what we're saying. They're using Discover Reading as a classroom-based program. They're seeing results they haven't seen before with these kids learning how to read. And you still get this natural separation of those students who need more attention, which they're now getting in small groups because they have a TA in the room as well. So they're getting attention, but the TA is trained in the Discover Reading program, as well as the teacher. See, so now everybody's on the same page. So you're going to get better results. And I'm keeping track of those results to see what they do, in fact, look like at the end of the school year. But right now, so far, so good. So, and then when it comes to tier 3, it's a different story, because if you're dealing with kids who are in that first percentile, I'm just telling you, you just need, hundreds of hours for those kids. And there are very few school districts that actually set up these kinds of intensive clinics. But there is in the Los Angeles Unified School District, which is, I think, something like 2 million children. They have about 20 what they call IDEC centers. And that's what they are. The kids are hauled from different schools across Los Angeles. They're hauled to these schools. That's all they do is intensive remediation for half the day. But it's system wide. Every 5 districts, we'll say, has one of these IDEC centers, or maybe every 20 districts. So the systems, around, well, systems in North America, everywhere in the world, they all try to deal with this phenomenon all the time. And we're all working towards this accomplished reader thing, but we're working with different kids at different degrees of proficiency in their reading and their spelling and their comprehension, all the rest of it. Very complex.
It is really complex.
Yeah.
So the same person here is wondering about I guess I'm wondering if it would be confusing to students to have a variety of instruction at different tiers.
It can be, but I think, I'm not sure there's a really good answer to that, but I think that it can be confusing if the child is introduced to different ways of learning the English code. So, for example, a lot of phonics program will teach things like the mule, I forget what they call the six syllable types and this kind of stuff. These are not effective strategies, actually, and they are more the outcome of print to speech approaches. And they're just not as effective. You don't need them in our experience. So the speech to print approach, I just keep hammering this, but I think, this has to be said, is a better way to go as far as teaching the English code is concerned. It doesn't get rid of all of the problems, but it's a better way to go. So, for example, if you have somebody who's been exposed to the English code that way, where they know the phoneme has to be spelled in a certain way, but they have trouble still remembering, which spelling is for which word, why would you introduce them then to something like that goes the other way around, goes from print to speech, and then starts overlaying everything with a bunch of rules? That's not going to work too well either. So we have to find ways to vary that speech to print approach. And that's what we do at the clinic. We just constantly look for ways to vary the same thing. We're not going to hit the kids over the head with a hammer, the same hammer all the time. Well, we are, but we're going to do it with different kind of hammers. Softer hammers, stronger hammers, more like
Well,
that.
different shaped hammers, just but with the same. Yeah, I get that. One other question here. So Discover Reading can be taught as a whole group instruction.
Yeah, it can, but I have to say, we're, as a clinic, when I first set up the clinic, I was just excited about what I saw in California where I was trained, and I just wanted these kids who were delayed to get this one-to-one instruction because I knew that was so important. So I never based what we do on a model of training a bunch of teachers. We tried that a few times. It didn't work well because you have no control. Once you've trained somebody, you have no control of what they're going to do with the program. So we're not really equipped to deal with this issue systemically. But there are programs out there who have that kind of experience and who can offer the school system that kind of service. And I think, honestly, I think the Empower people have really got that one wrapped up. I mean, that's a wonderful program. It's got 35 years of research behind it. And they have the infrastructure to deliver that program to a whole school system. So they can screen,
There are a
they can
few
train.
holes with it though, Steve, from what I'm hearing.
There's
First of
what?
all, it was designed for middle school kids.
No,
So
no, 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 no.
are you sure?
Oh yeah, I'm sure. And you can work with younger kids too. I mean,
Okay.
what I'm saying is there's no one perfect solution.
Oh, yeah, no.
That's for sure. I mean, there's not one particular program that's going to do everything for everybody. So I think the one thing that science is giving us now is more information about what could be effective. The problem that we still have, though, is the way science measures things, and people still get divided into different camps, and they'll argue about print to speech versus speech to print, and not necessarily have much experience with it. Or they'll point out to this, this kind of study and that kind of study, and you you have to be really on the ball to sort of differentiate all that noise, and separate the wheat from the chaff. You can argue forever. In the end, I chose this particular route. I'm glad I did. I have learned that there's more than one way to teach a child how to read, but I think that the ways that we have now learned through experience and through varying amounts of very suggestive research is that speech to print is the way to go in teaching the English code. The problem is there are no gold standard research studies actually comparing those two approaches. I mean, think of it. It's taken me 25 years to even realize that that's what I was doing with speech to print. And then once I realized that, I started digging out these studies that showed, yeah, if you go in that direction, you're probably going to get better results. But gold standard research, it'll be another 20 years before anybody says definitively, oh yeah, speech to print is the way to go. Well, I'm sticking my neck out and saying it now. I just think it is the way to go, and especially if you want to still do something about the large majority of children who need classroom instruction. You have to pick a good program to start with, and then you'll see good results. Yeah.
All
So,
right. Well, it's 8 o'clock. So I think we'll wrap it up here. I will send an email out, as I have said all along, which includes the recording of this session in case you want to go
great.
back over it or in case you didn't make it here. And any other questions? Amanda, do you want to put in Steve's email and your email into the chat right now? It might take me a couple of days to send out the email. I've got a few things going on in another presentation tomorrow night. And thank you very, very much for coming tonight. Again, we have this presentation tomorrow about the disability tax credit and applying for it. So if you're interested in that, even if you're not a parent, you could come and maybe learn about it a little bit more so that you can have something to recommend to your students or your clients. And thanks for your support. Hopefully we'll see you at more presentations. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for everything, Kathy. All your work over the years. It's been wonderful.
Oh,
And
thank you.
and I hope that whoever came tonight got a little bit out of the session and I didn't rant too much.
Okay. Thanks so much.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.